is there a common virus that could be quietly messing with your brain as you get older? Well, there might be. It's called Cytomegalovirus, or CMV, and a lot of adults carry it without ever knowing. And here's the scary part. Some research may suggest that CMV may be linked to faster memory decline in certain people, which raises a big question. What is it doing in the body for decades, and why does it seem to hit some people harder than others? In this video, I will show you what a group of researchers are discovering about this pesky pathogen and its specific mechanisms that link it to the brain and its associated memory decline.
That means we have a more inflammatory response happening. So it's important when we're looking at more neuroinflammation.
Performing some basic biochemical experiments to assess gene expression.
Examining the different gene expression that are occurring throughout infections for my cells.
We are just at the beginning of understanding this phenomenon.
I'm Ethan Yovanovich, and this is Catalyst Scientific Discoveries. I want you to take a second and think about your own body. You tend to think of it as yours, right? Like it's your house, you have the keys, you pay the mortgage, you're the only one living in it. But what if I told you that you have a roommate? And it's not a good roommate. Most of the time, they're quiet. You don't even know they're there. They sleep all day, they keep the noise down. But every once in a while, when you're stressed or tired or sick, they wake up and they start punching holes in the drywall. They start cutting the electrical wires. And then, just as quickly as they appeared, they go back to sleep. For years, scientists thought this roommate was harmless, just a bit of biological baggage that we all carry around. But a new study from Dr. Angela Shirazi and her team at Tulane University suggests that this is something we shouldn't overlook. And here's the part we need to pay attention to. Statistically speaking, you probably have it right now. Okay, let's just put this out there. We are talking about a virus, specifically Cytomegalovirus. Now, that is a mouthful, so scientists call it CMV, and we will do the same for the rest of this video. If you've never heard of CMV, don't worry, that's by design. It is the ninja of the viral world. It is a member of the herpes virus family, which means it's a cousin to the viruses that cause chickenpox and cold sores. And like its cousins, it has a superpower: latency. That means once it gets into your body, it never leaves. Ever. There is no cure, there is no vaccine. It writes its genetic code into your cells and stays there until the day you die. And here's the kicker. It is incredibly common. Depending on where you live, anywhere from 50 to 90% of all adults have it. Most of us catch it when we're kids. Maybe you had a fever for a day. Maybe you felt a little tired. Maybe you felt nothing at all. But ever since then, it has been sleeping in your immune system. Now, for decades, the medical consensus was, who cares? If you're healthy, CMV is basically harmless. It's just background noise. But Dr. Angela Shirazi asked a different question. She asked, is it really harmless? Or are we just not looking close enough?
For the majority of us who experience this, though, we don't really notice. We don't have a large number of symptoms. They aren't very robust. So it's a mild to moderate infection that can easily be masked by other things. And so many of us have been exposed to cytomegalovirus and we live our lives with occasional reactivation of this that really doesn't seem to affect us, in our day-to-day lives. Now, that doesn't mean it's not affecting our brain, and that's the subject of the research that we're trying to do in the lab.
Harmless implies that it does nothing. But what if it's doing something small, over and over and over again? What if the damage isn't an airstrike? What if it's a covert operation happening cell by cell? What if our brains don't age just because of time, but because of a hidden war unfolding inside of us? We are about to break down the specific study that connects this common virus to the thing we all fear: dementia. And the mechanism? It comes down to a fortress wall inside your head that is slowly being breached. To understand why this virus matters, we have to talk about the blood-brain barrier. Now, We're going to call it the BBB. We've talked about the BBB on this channel before, but it is impossible to overstate how important this is. Think of your brain as a fortress, a heavily protected, deliberately engineered stronghold. It is highly selective. It is tightly regulated. The BBB serves as the barrier itself, a continuous cellular wall lining every cerebral blood vessel. And it is carefully guarded. Oxygen is admitted. Glucose is admitted. Essential nutrients are admitted. And it blocks everything else. Toxins, bacteria, viruses, random chemicals, they all get stopped at the gate. When you are young and healthy, nothing gets through your BBB without permission. This barrier is made of endothelial cells that are stitched together by something called tight junctions. Imagine two bricks glued together so tightly that not even water can pass between them. Now that is a tight junction. It maintains a perfect chemical balance for your neurons to fire. Now, I want to nerd out on these tight junctions for a minute, because glue is too simple of a word. These junctions are complex, dynamic machines. The star of the show here is a protein called Claudin 5. Think of Claudin 5 as the cement that seals the BBB. This cement, the tight junctions, is what makes the BBB such a highly selective wall. When your blood-brain barrier is healthy, these bricks are bonded so tightly that they can block a molecule as small as a single ion. Something so tiny that you could line millions of them across the width of a single grain of sand. It is the tightest seal in the entire human body. But the study found that in infected mice, the levels of Claudin 5 dropped. The wall was losing its cement. And when the cement between the bricks weakens, the space doesn't stay small. It widens. Fibrinogen seeps into those newly opened gaps and enters the brain. Fibrinogen is a massive protein. For it to reach the brain, the wall had to give way significantly. It's the difference between a hairline fracture and a section of the wall breaking open. But this is where Dr. Engler-Shirazi's study gets interesting. She wanted to know what happens to this wall when it gets attacked, not once, but repeatedly. You see, CMV isn't always asleep. When you get stressed, let's say you have a bad day at work, or you get the flu, or you just get older, your immune system gets distracted. And CMV takes that opportunity to wake up. It reactivates. Your body fights it back down, of course. You usually win the battle. But for a few days, there is a skirmish. Dr. Engler-Shirazi calls this intermittent infection. So she asked the question, does the wall hold up after one raid? Probably. But what about after 10 years? After 50? What happens when the wall has to hold against that kind of force again and again for decades? So how do you test this? You can't exactly lock a human in a lab for 70 years and monitor their virus levels. The researchers turned to the most reliable model we have for studying mammalian biology, the mouse model. But, and this is important, Dr. Engler-Shirazi didn't use genetically engineered mice or strains bred to be vulnerable to the disease. She used wild-type mice. These are standard healthy mice with no modifications, essentially mice with the biological default setting. Just like you are a normal, healthy human, she wanted to see if the virus alone was enough to cause damage without any genetic cheating. Okay, here's the setup. Group A was just the control group. No virus, just happy, healthy mice living their best life. Group B was the experimental group. They were infected with the mouse version of CMV at 2 months old. But here's the twist. They didn't just infect them and walk away. They mimicked the human experience of reactivation. Every 3 months, they triggered the virus to wake up. They gave the immune system a little poke. Every 3 months, the infected mice were exposed to the virus again. This was done on purpose to mimic what happens in humans, where CMV doesn't just show up once. It can wake up and reactivate over and over throughout life. They followed the mice for 12 months. Now, 12 months might not sound like a long time to you, but for a mouse, that's middle age. That's the equivalent of tracking a human from their 20s into their 50s. This is what makes the study so unique. It wasn't looking for a sudden crisis. It wasn't looking for a massive stroke or a brain infection that kills you in a week. It was looking for the slow burn. It was looking for the pathogen burden. That's a phrase you're going to want to remember. The pathogen burden. It's the idea that your health isn't just about how you feel today. It's the receipt for every infection you've ever fought. So after a year of these intermittent battles, the researchers took a look inside the brains of these mice. And what they found? Well, let's just say the bank vault wasn't looking so secure anymore. The first thing they checked was the integrity of the wall. Was the BBB still keeping the bad stuff out? To test this, they looked for specific molecular spies. They looked for things that are supposed to be in the blood, but are never supposed to be in the brain. If you find salt water in your freshwater tank, you know something upstream has gone very wrong. Well, they found salt water. Specifically, they found two major culprits. First, the antibody IgG. It is a soldier of the immune system. It lives in the blood. It has no business being inside the brain tissue unless something has gone wrong. Second, they found fibrinogen. Now, this is a protein that helps your blood clot. Again, great for a scraped knee, but terrible for a neuron. In the infected mice, the ones who had been fighting this silent war, the levels of IgG and fibrinogen inside the brain were significantly higher. The wall was leaking. The tight junction, remember those glued bricks, were failing. Specifically, Claudin 5, the cement that seals the BBB, was breaking down. The virus hadn't stormed the castle, it hadn't burned the castle down, it had just chipped away at the mortar day after day, year after year, until the stones started to slip. But a leaky wall was just the beginning. Because when the researchers looked even closer at the cells themselves, they found that the cells' energy systems were faltering. They still had some charge left, but it wasn't steady. And Dr. Engler-Shirazi wanted to know why. Was the virus attacking the wall directly, or was it doing something more subtle?
We don't think that this virus gets in and infects our neurons. We think that instead it gets into cells outside of our brain and the immune response activates, and that's what's affecting how our brain functions.
The team zoomed in even further. They looked inside the cells that make up the blood-brain barrier. And this is where the story shifts from a war to an energy story. Now, we talk a lot about mitochondria on this channel. You know them as the powerhouse of the cell. They burn fuel to keep the lights on. Well, the cells that protect your brain, they need a massive amount of energy. Maintaining a perfect, airtight seal against the blood is exhausting work. It's like running on a treadmill that never slows down. You stay upright, but only by burning through every bit of fuel that you have. When the researchers looked at the mitochondria in the infected mice, they expected to see them shutting down, but they saw the opposite. The mitochondria were working overtime. They were redlining. The study showed increased basal mitochondrial function. Now, you might think that sounds great, more energy. But in biology, you don't want an engine that is constantly revving in the red zone. Because when an engine runs too hot, it produces exhaust. In biological terms, we call this oxidative stress. The researchers found elevated levels of something called superoxide. Think of superoxide as the toxic smoke that comes out of a dirty engine. If you can produce a little bit of it, your body can clean it up, no problem. But because these mice were fighting the virus over and over again, their engines never got a break. The smoke built up. It started to rust the machinery. And this is a double whammy. On one hand, you have the virus poking holes in the wall. On the other hand, the repair crew is working so hard to fix the holes that they are burning themselves out. They are poisoning the very environment that they are trying to save. And this creates a stage of neuroinflammation. Now, inflammation is a buzzword we hear a lot. We talk about anti-inflammatory diets, how inflammation causes aging. But in the brain, inflammation is disastrous. The brain relies on silence. It relies on a calm chemical environment to send electrical signals. Neuroinflammation is like noise. It's static. Imagine trying to have a complex philosophical conversation in the middle of a heavy metal concert. You can't hear, you can't think, you can't connect the dots. This is what's happening inside the brains of these mice. The virus wasn't killing the neurons directly. It was just turning up the volume of the noise until the brain couldn't hear itself think. But of course, this brings us to the most important question of all. Did it actually matter? Sure, the cells were stressed. Sure, the wall was leaky. But did the mice actually act any differently? Did they get dementia? To test this, the researchers used something called the Y maze. And it is exactly what it sounds like, a maze shaped like the letter Y. It is a classic test for working memory. Here's how it works. You put a mouse in the maze. Mice are naturally curious. If they just went down the left arm, the next time they come to center, they should want to check out the right arm. It's simple. I've been there, now I want to go there. This requires them to remember where they were about 30 seconds ago. It is the mouse equivalent of remembering where you put your keys, or remembering why you walked into the kitchen. Now, you might be thinking, it's a mouse. Maybe it just didn't feel like exploring. But that's the beauty of the spontaneous alternation task. It relies on a fundamental instinct that hasn't changed in millions of years. Rodents are foragers. If they just found food on the left tunnel, their biology screams at them, go check out the right tunnel, that's where the new food is. It's a survival mechanism. If a mouse just goes back to the same tunnel it just came from, it's not being lazy, it's engaging in a fatal error. In the wild, that mistake means starvation. So when Dr. Engler-Shirazi saw these mice returning to the same empty arms over and over again, it wasn't just a quirk. It was a breakdown of the executive self. It was the mouse losing the ability to map its own recent past. And that is exactly what we see in the early stages of human cognitive decline, the inability to track the now. So how did our viral mice do? They failed, significantly. The mice with intermittent viral history couldn't remember which arm they had just visited. They would go left, then they would go left again. They seemed confused. They had cognitive deficits. And remember, these mice weren't sick. They weren't lying in the corner with a fever. They looked fine, but their working memory was shot. The researchers compared them to mice that were just old. And the scary part? The brains of the infected mice looked a lot like the brains of the old mice. The virus had essentially accelerated the clock. So what does that mean for us? Because obviously, you are not a mouse, and most likely don't live in a maze. But you might carry this virus. If you're over 40, there's a better than 50-50 chance that CMV is sleeping in your cells right now. Does this mean you are doomed to get dementia? Absolutely not. Dr. Engler-Shirazi is very deliberate here. She is not claiming that CMV causes dementia. She is saying that it's a risk factor. It challenges the way we think about brain aging. We usually look for the smoking gun. We look for the big tragedy, the stroke, the head injury, the bad gene. But this research suggests that maybe the problem is much quieter. Maybe the problem is that for 40 years, your brain has been enduring a slow, grinding siege, an enemy that never leaves. It just keeps pressing at the gates. And eventually the fortress starts to wear down. The pathogen burden becomes too heavy to carry. So, is there any good news here? Actually, yes. Because now that we know the mechanism, we can do something about it. Remember the key word from the study: reactivation. The damage didn't just come from having the virus, it came from the virus waking up over and over again. So the strategy isn't eviction, because we can't get rid of it yet. The strategy is sedation. We need to keep the roommate asleep. How do you do that? Well, think about what wakes it up. Stress? Inflammation? A weak immune system? This brings us back to the basics of health. When you prioritize sleep, you aren't just resting, you are giving your immune system the resources it needs to keep CMV in the cage. When you reduce chronic stress, you are lowering the cortisol levels that normally tell the virus, hey, the guards are distracted, it's time to riot. When you exercise, you are flushing the system and strengthening that blood-brain barrier. You aren't just being healthy, you are acting as the guard. You are keeping the fortress secure. This study is a wake-up call. It tells us that brain health isn't just about the brain, it is about the whole history of our body. It is about every cold, every flu, every stressor you've ever had adding up on that ledger. It suggests that some of the changes we associate with just getting old might actually be preventable. We tend to fear the unknown, but sometimes the biggest threat is the ones we've lived with our whole lives, the one that is woven into our DNA. But knowledge is power. And now that we know the roommate is there, we can make sure they don't tear the house down. So, I'm curious, does knowing that you might carry a sleeping virus change how you view your health? Does it make you want to prioritize that sleep schedule a little more? Well, let me know in the comments. And if you find this deep dive fascinating, if you want to support this channel so we can keep venturing into these scholarly topics on your behalf, tap that like button. It strengthens the signal routing network. And this is Catalyst Scientific Discoveries. See you in the next one.